وأؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم في هذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
وأؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم في هذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
وشلها يا ولد شايلة دمع الزينة حب دمع عروس، وشايلة دمع الزينة حب دمع عروس. العرين اللي على العليا صعد، العرين اللي على العليا صعد.
نؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم لهذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
نؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم في هذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
وأؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم في هذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
نؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم لهذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
نؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم لهذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة من أغذية وأدوية وأجهزة طبية ومنتجات تجميل ومبيدات وأعلاف. خلال 2019 ورد إلى المنافذ الحدودية نحو 360 ألف إرسالية، وتولى مفتشو الهيئة الموجودون فيها فحص واختبار أكثر من 2,700,000 منتج، ورفضوا فسح أكثر من 100,000 منتج لعدم مطابقتها للمواصفات. ويتواصل العمل وبذل أقصى الطاقات لضمان سلامة كل المنتجات المستوردة.
وشلها يا ولد شايلة دمع الزينة حد دمع عروس، وشايلة دمع الزينة حد دمع عروس. العرين اللي على العليا صعد، العرين اللي على العليا صعد.
نؤكد لكم حرصنا الشديد على توفير ما يلزم المواطن والمقيم في هذه الأرض الطيبة من دواء وغذاء واحتياجات معيشية. إن القطاعات الحكومية كافة في مقدمتها وزارة الصحة تبذل كل ما لديها من إمكانياتها اتخاذ التدابير الضرورية للمحافظة على صحة المواطن والمقيم.
هنا وفي كل المنافذ الحدودية البرية والبحرية والجوية، يرابط مئات المفتشين من الهيئة العامة للغذاء والدواء على مدار الساعة، مزودون بكل الوسائل المتقدمة، يعملون من أجل سلامة ومأمونية ما تستورده المملكة.
Okay, thank you very much, Ali. And to everybody out there, good day, and welcome to this session. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. My name's Christian Steele. I'm going to be your moderator today, but I'm joined by three colleagues who you should be able to see. I'm going to introduce them to you in a moment, and in the meantime, I'll just give you a little bit more details about what we're going to be covering today. So we've got an hour and 15 minutes, so that should take us to approximately the hour ahead of us. I'm speaking from the United Kingdom in London, so that will be 3 o'clock my time. The agenda we've got to speak to you today about, I hope you will find interesting, and it's going to be discussing what we have been working on in the field of creating a procurement index that looks at the subject of sustainability for the health sector. And we've called this a clinic because we wanted to walk through various features of what we've been doing and what this project is about. And discuss this both amongst ourselves in some Q&A sessions, but also hopefully bringing some Q&A from you as the audience as well. We are taking this project with our partners UNDP and Healthcare Without Harm. We are further supported in this work by two other organisations. We have associates who are experts on labour and human rights, and another organisation called CPAs, who are specialists in toxicity and chemicals. And there's another organisation called Composite, who have been working with us on the platform that will deliver the index that we're going to be sharing with you today. Our work has been undertaken under the programme of sustainable production in the health sector. This is the SPHS that you'll be familiar with, but we are calling it Sustainable Procurement Index in health, SPIH for short. So these are the terms that I suspect you will see talked about through the course of the next session. Next slide, please. So the next slide is coming through. I'll go to the second slide, please. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. So this is our agenda today. Yes, perfect. Thank you. This is the agenda today. But before I just give a brief introduction to that, I'd like to just call upon my co-presenters today, and maybe they can provide a little background to themselves. So Callum, I'll go to you first, please.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Callum Neiman. I lead Arup's International Development Group, and I spent most of my career working in the international development world, living a lot in Africa and Asia. Have a background in health projects, and so in this project with Arup, I provide some of the high-level direction on the project, and I also provide some of the background from the health sector. And can I just check if everybody's hearing everything okay? Because Christian, you were breaking up quite a bit when you were speaking earlier. So it'd just be good to confirm from our hosts that people are hearing okay.
What I can do, Callum, as well is put on a headset, which maybe will just assist in picking up my voice a bit better.
Okay, we'll assume that somebody will tell us if there's overall sound problems.
Okay. Maybe we could go to Anna, please.
Hi everybody, my name is Anna Tuddenham. I'm a climate change consultant at Arup working across adaptation and carbon. In this project I am helping assist on the greenhouse gas emissions component and the resource depletion component, so the indicators related to those topics, and also leading the stakeholder engagement phase. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. And Terry, we'll go to you now, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Terry Ellis. I'm a senior consultant here at Arup. I'm involved in the shaping of the various concepts that will go into the index, as well as helping across all the topic areas. In a previous role, I was a sustainable procurement manager for a firm working in-house, so I've got a good appreciation of the overall procurement picture as well.
Great, thank you very much. And you're going to be hearing from Callum, Anna, and Terry as we go through the slides today, with each of them talking a bit about the various features of the index. Myself, I'm an engineer, but I've taken my career into the area of sustainability and its application to the built environment and to the health sector. And my area of specialism within this is around systems modeling and looking at impacts of these sorts of systems. My role on this project is as project manager. So the agenda that we've got to cover today, you can see it here on the slide. What we wanted to do was start with a bit of a high-level introduction and just talk a bit in and around what the project is about. We're then going to discuss how we've been working with stakeholders on the project, the engagement exercises and participation that we've had with them. We'll move on then to discuss the index in terms of the vision and what we want it to look like and feel like and how it will be used. And we hope this will be made a little bit more more perspective will be brought to this by preparing and sharing with you a couple of user journeys to it. And then finally, we will, to the end, talk about how we're going to pilot it. And at the end there, we have the opportunity to bring some questions forward from you, the audience. So make sure as you have questions coming forward or you're thinking about them, share those back to us. And I'll provide you with an email address through which you can do that in a moment. The way in which we're going to do this is my colleagues are going to present some of these sections to you, and I am going to ask them some questions about what they are presenting. So in this way, we can have a bit of a dialogue and hopefully draw out key points around the content here, and you will take away some learnings from that. So I will go to the next slide, please. So this is the address. If you have questions that are arising through the course of this presentation today, the email address is there at the bottom of this slide. You can see it. It is g20icae@saudisecretariat.gov.sa. If you write that down and you send in your questions as we go along, they should be shared back to us towards the end of the presentation, and hopefully we can pick up some of those at the end and provide some response to them. So I'll go to next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to ask Callum to come forward, and he's going to talk to this subject and provide a bit more detail about what the SPIH project is all about. Callum, over to you.
Great, thank you, Christian. So yeah, I'm going to provide an overview of the SPIH project, the Sustainable Procurement Index for Health project, and tell you a bit about what it's about. Next slide, please. So in looking at this as a summary, what are we trying to do here? Well, on a very simple level, we're trying to develop an index or a tool that helps people to understand the sustainability of various items that are purchased, manufactured, procured, purchased, used in the healthcare sector. And when we talk about sustainability, we've defined that in terms of 4 domains. So those are greenhouse gas emissions, resource depletion, looking at water, energy, and material consumption, chemical or toxic impact on human health and the environment, and then human, labour rights and gender equality. So those are the 4 domains that make up sustainability. At present, there isn't a tool that exists that brings these together in an easy-to-use way. So we're trying to develop a tool, an index that can give a measurement on all these. We want it to be something that's recognised globally and can then be used by a variety of different stakeholders. So this could include policymakers, manufacturers, suppliers, procurers, healthcare facilities, and end users. And the intention is that if you're producing an item, you can say where it stands in relation to these 4 domains of sustainability. If you are procuring an item, if you're buying an item, you can understand where that item stands in those different domains of sustainability. So that's at a high level what we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. So in trying to do this, we then had to identify some of the key factors that are going to make it work. So we've identified 4 things here. And the first point there says supporting decision-making of buyers and providing certainty to suppliers. So if you are procuring something for health services, you will normally look at what the cost is. You will normally look at aspects of quality. You may want to look at aspects of sustainability, but do you have the data? So what we're trying to do is provide a tool that can help the decision-making of buyers so that when they are making decisions on what to buy, they can understand the sustainability aspects of those items. Equally, suppliers then need to understand what is being looked at by buyers. If buyers are going to start making purchasing decisions based on certain aspects of sustainability, suppliers need to understand what those are so they can provide relevant information about that. So decision-making of buyers and suppliers goes together there. Second point is it needs to be a robust and transparent method, and it needs to clearly communicate expectations. And so the key points there, first of all, on transparency and communication. People need to be able to understand what this is. They need to understand the components within it, the information it's giving. It needs to be simple enough that people can make decisions using it. If it's not easy to understand, if it's not transparent, people are not going to use it. Equally, it needs to be robust in that people need to have a high degree of trust in it. People need to believe the data, the results that they're getting out of it. They need to look at it and say, yes, if I'm making decisions based on this index, I am confident that this is based on relevant and useful data. Again, if people do not feel that it's trustworthy, if they do not feel it's robust, they won't use it. So it must be robust and transparent. The third point then talks about it being proportionate and relevant. And what do we mean there? Well, if it's too difficult to use, if it's too expensive, if it's too time consuming, people are not going to use it. So again, we need to make sure that it's robust enough, but it's not overly complex. It doesn't become too difficult to use. Similarly, if the information within it isn't relevant to what's happening in the world these days, then people won't use it. If people start saying the data in it is out of date, the key points in it are no longer useful for us, they won't use it. So it has to be proportionate and relevant. And then the final point there is that it's not just giving you a snapshot of the current status, telling you whether an item is in a good or a bad situation regarding sustainability. It's got to provide a pathway for improvement. So the likelihood is that at present, if you were to look at any particular item, so some items might do well in all 4 domains of sustainability, some might do well in one or another. But if you're not doing well in one area, you then need to say, well, how do we improve this? What are the measures we need to put in place to create improvement so that suppliers or producers know what to do to improve their rating? And again, buyers can see what is being done to improve rating. So those are the key aspects that will make it a relevant and a useful tool. Next slide, please. So how are we going to do this? Well, we divided the project into 4 sections: definition, development, piloting, and the last one, it says testing, but that's actually training. That's what that should be. And we are currently in the development stage, as you can see on the screen. What does it mean in each of those sections? So the definition section, we identified various stakeholders that would be interested and impacted by the tool. We did some primary research with these groups, and there'll be more explanation given on that later in the presentation. We did some literature review, on similar indices in different sectors and on assessment methods. We brought all this data together and we have assembled an expert group with UNDP to then check and challenge our idea. And so with the definition phase, we were able to define those 4 domains of the index. Then in the development phase, which is where we are now, we've then been identifying which indicators go into each of the domains, how those will be measured, how they will be scored to create an overall index, bringing those together into an online platform that can then be used to launch the index. The next stage following that, which will be towards the start of next year or at the start of next year, we'll be piloting that in a few locations to see how well it works. And following the pilot, we'll then be moving into a process of doing training and rolling it out. So that's the process, and as I said, we're in the development stage.
Okay, Callum, thank you very much. So if we could just go to the next slide. So it's my job today to keep us on a tight schedule, but I do get the opportunity to ask the occasional question as we go through. I've actually got 2 questions for you, but we've only really got time for answers for one. So I'm going to ask you both, and you can choose which one you want to answer, Callum. So my first was, how does the SPIH align with the UN SDGs? Maybe a perspective to that would be something you could share with us. The alternative is, based on your experience, a lot of it field-based and working in public health, what excites you about this project and the development of the SPIH?
I'm going to go for the second question because it's a bit more personal. I have spent considerable time in my past life working on public health projects based in Africa and Asia. I've been involved in projects that have cured large volumes of certain health items, a notable example being anti-malarial bed nets. We've spent millions of dollars on those projects. And when we were doing those projects, we would often have discussions on the procurement process. Looking at the cost, we're looking at the quality, what information do we have? Occasionally, a question would come up that would say, well, what do you know about something like the greenhouse gas emissions? Or what do you know about the labour situation of people that produce them? And at the time when I was working on these projects, there was very little information available. And so I can see very easily how an index, if it's structured well, and if it's straightforward to use, if it's got the right information in it, that could have a significant impact on how you make decisions. You could start making decisions that factor in quality, cost, and sustainability. And then if you as a buyer are making your decisions based on sustainability as a key aspect, then producers are going to start thinking about that as well and trying to make sure that they've considered those aspects in their production. So from my experience, I can see how this could actually turn into a very useful practical tool, and so that excites me about it.
Great, thank you very much, Callum. Okay, so we'll move on then. If we could go to the next slide. And in this section of our presentation, what we wanted to talk was about the stakeholder engagement process that we've used alongside what we've been doing to make sure that we bring the many different partners and organizations that this is going to be relevant to into the exercise of creating and delivering this index. And my colleague Anna is going to share some thoughts around this over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. So Anna, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christian. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So during the definition work package, which was the first work package that Callum presented during the project plan, we engaged with a number of organisations from key stakeholder groups and different geographies. In the context of the index, the buyers, suppliers and NGOs are the most directly relevant as the project seeking to create and apply an index. However, other groups provide vital content for how the index is positioned in public procurement more generally. Thus, in addition to the buyer and supplier groups, we engage with NGOs, including UN agencies and regulatory agencies, who in future could require that the index is used and set the governance requirements for this. Research bodies, who can help analyse and shape the index. And standards bodies, who can help operationalise the index and share learnings and findings from other existing similar products. We also spoke to the expert panel that we've put together and are engaging with throughout the project, who provide valuable external review to the work. Next slide, please. So how do we engage with those stakeholder groups? With these stakeholders, we engaged in a variety of different ways. Firstly, we issued a survey to the expert panel asking key questions regarding the concept, function and design of the index. Secondly, we undertook interviews with individuals focusing on suppliers in particular. Thirdly, we shared our survey more widely to an extended base of suppliers, including geographies such as South Africa and India. And finally, we supplemented this engagement with extensive literature review, including following up on key references from the interviews that we'd done, as well as best practice analysis across sectors. Next slide, please. Thank you. So during our engagement, we asked about 8 key aspects shown on the slides. Number 1, whether the index should be for an organisation or a product or both. Here we received feedback for both product and organisation-based indices. 2, whether the same indicators should be asked of all products or if they should be flexed accordingly. Here we received feedback for both again. There was positive feedback for standardisation, but support for adjustment of specifics. 3, whether the requirements of the index should be modified depending on characteristics of the healthcare setting. Here there was a suggestion for adjusting based on competency, but firm messaging that the index should be applicable to all. 4, if the buyer should be able to select which aspects of the index are applicable to their product or organisation. Now, we had a mixed response to this question, debating between consistency and flexibility and the importance of political and economic considerations. 5, we asked if the index should provide a single result or a more complex result. This resulted in a range of views, with a suggestion of using a single score with more data behind it, or a baseline set of requirements that all vendors must meet at a minimum. 6, if the index would be most effective if rolled out by the buyer or supplier, and here it was commonly thought best to be buyer-led, eventually transitioning to the market. 7, what barriers might be expected in the implementation of the index. Responses here included a range of responses, such as legal and regulatory demands, supplier pushback, survey fatigue, healthcare standards and financial considerations. And finally, 8, what key networks or standards do organisations currently adopt or report to? For example, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. Next slide, please. So based on that engagement, we received some very useful feedback. Let's start with the buyers' comments first, who in the index are organisations that would request the index is used and review the information provided to them from suppliers. Buyers expressed a key desire for information to inform their decision-making, for a mechanism to choose suppliers based on key indicators, and for flexibility that enabled the index to fit within their internal priorities. Key barriers to adoption of the index that buyers identified included difficulty integrating with other third-party tools because of the resource required, cost and time implications for companies involved in piloting, and training required to implement the index into their purchasing framework. Next slide, please. Moving on to suppliers' findings, who in the context of the index are the organisations required to provide information into the index. The suppliers expressed a desire to be able to position products in the market and show that they are satisfying key standards, to also understand clearly what's expected of them now and at intervals in the future, and to be able to differentiate themselves in the market. Key barriers that suppliers identified to adoption were the buyers having control of the index, the ability of suppliers to have the capacity and capability to respond to these new requirements, and uncertainty into the future in terms of the index's rollout, uptake, and so on. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Anna. So remember, everybody, if you've got any questions that come forward as you're hearing these presentations, please share them back through the channel that we put forward earlier. But at this point, Anna, I've got a couple of questions for you too. And the first is, I guess, around the new and emerging concept and content that this index may present for many different organizations. And those both on the buyer and supplier side are going to be quite varied in terms of their size and in terms of the capacity they perhaps have to respond to the index. What sort of feedback did you get around that that sort of subject from the exercises that you undertook around talking to stakeholders?
Sure. So a key concern of the suppliers and the buyers was the equality of the index and how differences in capacity might discriminate against smaller suppliers with fewer resources. Now, we understand this, and we understand that proportionality is also important, and are making the index as accessible as possible by developing a tiered approach. This is something that Terry will go into in the next section, and also by linking it to existing certifications so as not to duplicate work that organisations may have already done. We also understand that some organisations might have already made already pushed efforts in this area, for example, on emissions, and reduced their percentage of emissions, for example, by a lot. And therefore, setting certain types of targets might disadvantage them. So the index has been built to ensure that scoring is fair around this aspect as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, something like this is, I guess, when it comes down to it, it's just a tool, an important tool that's going to affect great change. But you'll need to bring in a lot of other things around it to make sure that the platform is going to work and deliver successfully. Now, one group of stakeholders that's going to be really important around this is those who are in charge or charged with creating policy around an agenda like this. So how do you think policymakers might engage with the SPIH?
So policymakers can use the index as a means to progress their sustainability agenda by building it into their own public procurement processes and helping policymakers and also help policymakers implement a consistent framework for evaluating suppliers. At the same time, they'll be encouraging the market to shift towards more sustainable practices and thus bringing up the baseline in the standards accepted.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. That was great to hear from you, and appreciate the perspectives you've given us there around stakeholders to this project and what it's trying to achieve. Okay, so if I can have the next slide now, please, we'll go on and start to talk about the vision for the index. And this is where we're going to hear from my colleague Terry, and he's going to explore a bit around some of the features, the perspectives of how it might look and feel. So Terry, over to you, please.
Thank you, Christian. So yeah, I've got about 10 or so slides. I'm just going to take these slowly and explain some of the key features and concepts that the index will have. Just want to stress at this point, as Callum mentioned in his first section, that we're still developing the index. So what we're going to show through this next section is still work in progress. And we're very keen, of course, for any questions and comments, thoughts on what's presented in this part. So if we could have the next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. So the first question that we had to resolve, and our stakeholder group was very helpful in this, is to really focus on which stage of the procurement process the index should be focused on. Now, it's clear that there are many ways in which a measurement tool for the supply chain could be used, starting at the pre-qualification stage through to a specific tender event, and then, of course, monitoring existing supply chain. The feedback that we received pushed us to really focus its use case as being part of a specific procurement activity, so as part of a buying event. Rather than the other two, although we very much have in mind that it could be flexible to use those in those other situations as well. So using it, embedding it as part of a procurement activity is our specific focus. And as Callum mentioned, we really felt that adding sustainability as a dimension into a buying event, as well alongside cost, availability, quality, all of those are really important factors, really would give the index the momentum to be adopted, rather than it potentially being optional, an optional thing. And this really supports one of the core aims of the project, which is to help shape the market. So by embedding it in the procurement activity directly, we want to leverage the power of procurement to motivate the supply chain to transition into more effective, more sustainable practices. And we had our eye on, in the long run, that the index could lend itself towards some kind of labelling scheme where a supplier voluntarily discloses their performance against the index, and it's perfectly capable of doing that. And again, just finally, a buyer-led solution where the buyer is integrating it into their procurement events is a really strong signal. We want to avoid any suggestion that sustainability is a voluntary aspect or an optional aspect. And so bearing in mind the proportionality principle that Anna mentioned a moment ago, we still want to leverage the power of the event to put something at stake and really use that to drive improvement. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key feedback points that Anna mentioned was about the organisation and product angle. And one of the key, we received a lot of kind of feedback on key barriers around capability and capacity to respond to certain aspects in sustainability. And those included barriers to entry in the market. Of course, being a UNDP SPHS led project, we're very focused on developing markets in particular. We also wanted to avoid penalising companies that have already made a lot of progress, as Anna mentioned, so the criteria needs to fit that. And we want to not have the perception, as Callum mentioned, of it being too difficult to participate in the index because the requirements are too tight. So with all that in mind, what we have come up with is a tiered approach. So I kind of outline this in a pyramid on the right-hand side of this slide. And this really neatly addresses this organizational product dilemma as well. So at the base of the pyramid, these lower, kind of enabling characteristics that lead to sustainable outcomes are where we're really focused. The basics, I guess you could describe them as. And what we found in our research is that really this is quite focused on the organizational aspects. So do companies have the right governance in place? Do they have people responsible for sustainability? These kinds of aspects. And that how we could structure the product level was to make them more challenging things to achieve. So at the top of the pyramid here, this is very specific to the climate aspect of the index. We have the full life cycle assessment or environmental product declaration of a specific product would be this very highest level aspect of the pyramid. So the most stretching, the most demanding aspect that you could expect from a supplier that was performing in a very sustainable way. So with essentially our approach here is to have those essentials at the bottom of the pyramid and the desirables at the top, and that over time we can motivate the supply chain to reach the top of the pyramid. And of course, as Anna and Callum both mentioned, the whole index will be transparent, so it'll be very clear what good looks like at the top of the pyramid. And finally, just to round off this aspect, there are some topic areas that don't fit a company or organizational lens very well, and equally there's some criteria that don't fit neatly within products. So for example, when it comes to labour standards, that's very much an organisational issue. It's not really related to the products per se. And equally, when it comes to the chemical and toxicity impacts, these can be very product-focused issues. And so our pyramid structure, these tiers, really allow us a bit of flexibility as to where we can incorporate some of these really important aspects. Next slide, please. So we mentioned earlier that there's 4 key themes, and I just wanted to quickly elaborate on what the thematic content of those is. So we have greenhouse gases, and we're covering issues around governance, measurement, target setting, and supply chain issues. Again, these are roughly aligned to the levels, so the kind of basics at the top, in the first bullet rather, sorry, and the more demanding aspects in the lower bullets. For the resources aspects, we're also considering governance, but then also the manufacturing process of the products and supply chain issues associated with that. For toxicity, we're focused on management issues, whether products contain restricted substances and the approach to managing that risk, and then also disclosure, labelling and those kinds of issues. And on the social angle, Again, policy and governance are really important here. We're interested in whether organisations undertake audits of both their own facilities and the supply chain. And then we have things like equality issues as well, which are also very important within the supply chain. And we're still working on these. These are broadly the areas that we expect to appear in the index when it's finally complete. But we're still working through the details of each of those aspects. Next slide, please. And just leading on to that, as Anna mentioned, we received very many comments on flexibility within the indicator set, and how things are organised within our concepts is really important here. So taking the pyramid approach that I mentioned a minute ago, our diagram on the right hand side here has the different levels. So level 1, level 2, level 3 being the most stretching level. And each of the boxes in that diagram represents a module that we're calling it. And within the module, there's different criteria or questions which are related to the different themes that I just mentioned. So in the first couple of columns there, we have the GHG modules. So we have a module at each level for the organizational aspects, and then a module at just level 2 and level 3 for the product focused aspects. And similarly for resources, for toxic impacts on human and labour rights and social issues, we have this arrangement of different modules. And some of these may be optional or flexible depending on the products in hand, the geography of the supply chain that we're interested in, etc. But we're really trying to make this as consistent as possible and as simple as possible so that it removes any barriers to adoption. Yeah, and by that, what I mean is that we only want to include very specific criteria where it's absolutely necessary. One example of that is going to be in pharmaceuticals, we think. Particularly for the toxic and chemistry aspects of pharmaceuticals, there are some very specific questions that we would like to make sure are included. And so there may be slightly different versions of the index that are tailored to those very specific circumstances. But it's very much a case of limiting those that flexibility unless it really is essential. And we're still working through the logic of this aspect as well. This may look a little bit different in its final form, but I think the general principles here we are more or less settled on at the present time. Next slide, please. So just to explain how we are thinking about the levels at a conceptual in a conceptual way. So each of the boxes within the diagram on the left here is a module, and in order to achieve different levels within the index overall, you have to pass each of the modules. So bear with me here, I'll try and explain this as simply as possible. So each module contains a certain number of questions. Each question has a certain amount of points or a scoring criteria attached to it. And in order to pass the module, you would have to meet a minimum number of points based on the questions contained within. So at a very basic level, each module or group of questions would be scored, and those pass thresholds would then indicate whether the supplier has achieved the minimum performance level required in order to pass that module. And then within the levels, the supplier needs to pass all of the modules within that level in order to achieve the overall level, in order to achieve that level overall. So I'll have an example of this in a moment. All of the scoring and approach will be transparent. So it's really important to us that it's clear how things will be scored so that the buyer and the supplier are operating from the same starting point. And very importantly, the transparency is crucial, because if we want to motivate the supply chain to perform better, then they need certainty over what the scoring mechanism is so that they can then choose to invest in improving activities, preparing the required evidence, all of these really important points. So all of this would be transparent to everyone. If we could just skip to the next slide then. So just to illustrate my point really clearly here, in terms of, let's assume that these were the results. So a tick in each of the boxes represents the fact that the minimum amount of points has been scored in each of the modules, and a cross means that it hasn't been achieved. So starting from the bottom in level 1 here, all of those modules have a tick. So that means that they have passed level 1, or you could say they are, they've achieved level 1 of the SPIH. When it comes to the second level, they've passed 5 of the modules, but critically not 2 of them, and therefore we wouldn't propose to say that they have passed at level 2. Now we will be able to present what the score is, and the respondent will be able to see where they have not scored well. But it's really important to us that all of them are achieved so that you can then pass over the threshold. So we're operating in a way of thresholds here. This is important because what we would like to do in practice is for the buyers to be able to set, if they wish, kind of a minimum expectation for the supply chain. So for example, at the very basic level, and this is what we propose when the SPIH is actually deployed initially, is that just by participating is enough to satisfy the requirements of a specific tender event. So just participating is all you need to do in order to qualify and be able to participate in that tender. But in time, a buyer may say the minimum level of performance or the minimum expectation is that a supplier achieves level 1. And therefore, it's really then clear to everyone what the requirements are going to be, and the suppliers can consider in advance how they would score against the various criteria that are set out. And in time, or for very specific or challenging procurement events, the buyers may choose to use level 2 or even level 3, or incentivize those the achievement of those levels in some way. So for another use case could be that once a supplier is on board, that they, over a period of time, are working towards achieving these levels. So it's not part of the procurement event itself initially, but it becomes a monitoring tool instead. And this might be very useful, for example, where there are SMEs involved that don't necessarily have the resources in place before the tender, but could work towards achieving a certain level in the future. Okay, next slide, please. So just to give some examples of what each module might look like, and these are very much snapshots, and again, I'll just stress that we're working on these at the moment. So, for example, at the basics for greenhouse gases in level 1, so this is very much focused on the organizational aspects of greenhouse gases. We would have some very simple questions here, like, do you measure scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions? The answers would be from a predetermined list. Or do you report your GHG footprint publicly? And you'll get different kind of points depending on what the answer was for them. And there may be different expectations in terms of evidence required. And each of those questions would be weighted within the module. So in this simple case here, we have 2 questions and they're weighted equally, 50-50. And then each question has different points available depending on the answer as well. And what we're going through at the moment is a process of balancing all of those factors in terms of setting the pass thresholds for each module. If we could just skip forward to the next slide, please. And a second example here is the manufacturing aspect for resources, where we've got a much broader set of criteria. In fact, this is only half of them. I couldn't fit them all on the slide here. But a much broader range of factors. And again, we're looking at aspects that are focused in the manufacturing process of a product. So the recycled content, the energy used, the water use, transportation and packaging would also feature in this module. And again, each of these aspects will be weighted and each will have a score attached to them as well. And what we're going through at the moment within the project team, and we're working with UNDP and SPHS, is to put these together and review them. We'll then be reaching out to a broader group, including our expert group, for comment, and it will definitely be a key feature of our piloting phase to review and check and challenge these factors. Next slide, please. And then just briefly to walk you through what it would look like, as Christian mentioned, Composity are working with the SPHS platform to provide us with a way to deploy this. It will be a web-based system. it will be a central point of truth for the SPIH. So the index itself will be hosted within the platform, and that's currently being developed and tested. And if we just skip to the next slide, we have some screenshots of, so if we could just skip to the next slide, please. There we go, thank you. We have some kind of screenshots of what that looks like in practice. So for example, you'll be able to navigate through the different modules within the index, which is this left-hand diagram here, where we have the different levels for greenhouse gases, for example. And then on the right-hand side, we have the way you would complete it. So there'll be a series of the modules will be presented in a series. Each one will have the questions embedded within it. And the user, the supply chain participant, would skip through each of the questions and provide their answer. Bearing in mind there might be different paths to follow through the questionnaire depending on the responses themselves. And of course, there might be different versions, as I mentioned earlier. For example, there might be specific sections for pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing. As it's all web-based, again, this provides maximum transparency for both parties and a good record, and also gives the potential for monitoring performance in the future as well. And then finally, the next slide, please. In terms of how the results will be presented, again, these are just concept diagrams at the moment, but of course we'll be able to express the overall score across the modules, which is on the left-hand side here. And then on the right-hand side, we'll be able to show for each module whether the pass threshold was achieved or not. And you would be able to dig into these a little bit further as well to understand which questions scored strongly and which didn't. And again, just to re-emphasize, that can be tracked over time. So each of the results is tied to the supplier. And as they are updated from time to time, this can be presented within the platform as well. So you can understand how they have improved their performance. And then just the next slide, please. And just the final point in terms of our concept and how we have tried to shape this. We're very keen to emphasize this moving the market, shaping the market point. And so we don't perceive the index to be a static thing. An initial version will be launched and the criteria will be as similar to as I've described over the past 10 or 15 minutes. But it's really important that over time those requirements become more stretching. And so we've identified the need for the owner of the SPIH, which will ultimately be the UNDP and SPHS, to from time to time review what the criteria are and decide whether they need to move between different levels in the index, or whether new stretching requirements need to be added, whether aspects in level 2 should be incorporated into level 1 in the future, etc. And to be able to communicate that to the supply chain is really important. So what is level 2 performance today might be considered level 1 performance in 2025, i.e. those more stretching aspects today will trickle down and become expected in the future. And again, this is really important because to send those clear signals of what is required, what the demands will be, allows the supply chain to choose to invest in ways to improve their business. They can understand exactly what's at stake, and that's good all round. It provides certainty and confidence in the market. So that's my section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Perfect. So look, you put a lot of content forward there and gave us a great set of perspectives around what this is going to look like, how it's going to feel to interact with, the levels of detail. So you can see there's a lot going on within these themes, within these topics, and the way they're being dealt with, scored, tested, looked at, and examined. I've got just a couple of maybe quite practical questions, really. I put myself in the shoes of someone who's a supplier, and I've been asked to put information into the platform. Can you give me a sense, Terry, of the sort of time and the sort of efforts around doing that? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so it's a good point, Christian, and we are very sensitive to this as I mentioned, I've worked in the supply chain environment myself before, and very understanding of the demands that can be placed on supply chain. Again, we've tried to add some flexibility in to how the modules are structured, and the way that the buyer can describe what the expectation is. So at the very basic level, to achieve the level 1 performance, for example, we're talking about a very limited set of questions, perhaps 10 to 12 questions overall across the different topics, which are basic isn't quite the right word, but foundational aspects that we would expect many organisations to already be quite capable of today. And the burden isn't too high because many of the questions are binary at level 1, so it's a yes or no answer, and you would perhaps attach some very simple evidence to that. And to support the preparation of those of the responses, again, we want to publish it fully transparently, the content of the index, so that suppliers can see in advance and not have to wait until they are asked what those criteria might look like, and therefore best prepare for that as efficiently as possible. And because it's we're targeting the health sector more broadly, it provides a bit more certainty in the questions that will get asked. So it's not going to be a different set of questions for each tender event in the healthcare sector. There's going to be more consistency in what's asked, and therefore hopefully they can answer once, and once will be enough to cover multiple tenders.
Great. And you also you picked up on my second question there, which was also around how do I get ready? And I think what you were showing there was that because it will be freely accessible and published, if you are interested to understand what is in it, there should be information and guidance around the criteria, how you can demonstrate performance against them. This will be published, it will be transparent, so that you would be able to access that and think about what it means in your setting, in your situation, capacitate yourself, get yourself ready. So in the eventuality that you seek to engage with it or are asked to engage with it, you can ensure that you're well positioned to do so successfully, correct?
Exactly, yes. And this is a critical point. Callum mentioned it right from the off. It's really important that everyone understands how things are structured, how you can score well, and again, it encourages them people to prepare properly. As I said, choose to invest in new technologies or improvements in businesses, and that delivers better outcomes for everyone involved.
Great. Okay, Terry, thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to look a little bit about user journeys. And this is about, let's say you are a buyer or supplier and you are going to interact with the platform that has been shared through the last slides to you. Anna and Terry are going to talk us through this. So I think first up we've got, is it Anna who's going to share a perspective around this for us? So take it away, Anna.
Brilliant, thanks. Next slide, please. Great. So as Christian said, we're going to walk you through 2 scenarios. The first one is a ship country buyer with a diverse supply chain. So what I'll do is I'll run you through those steps that are presented on the screen with a little bit more detail. So in this scenario, the buyer is located in Tanzania and would like to set up a long-term agreement for the provision of a generic pharmaceutical. This will commence in 2021 until 2025. It's one of the larger contracts that will be placed at the current time. The main suppliers are in China and India. Some of the companies have recently presented to the buyer on sustainability credentials, while some of their peers have not. These suppliers are all well established. Now, the buyer decides that sustainability should be part of the award criteria for the tender at a level of 10%. They decide to place a minimum requirement of level 1, that bottom tier, to participate. For those that achieve level 2, they will get 5% of the 10% available, and for those that achieve level 3, they will receive the full 10% of that 10 available. Now, four companies of the potential supply base decide to bid for this long-term agreement. One supplier based in China provides an initial response indicating that they've achieved level 2. However, when the buyer reviews the submission, they find that the labour audit is out of date and the supplier cannot provide more recent evidence. Now, the buyer therefore decides to exclude that supplier. One of the other suppliers achieves only level 1, so it is allowed to participate in the procurement event, and they are appointed to the long-term agreement. The buyer then puts in an improvement plan in place to bring them up to the level 2 across their 4 years of the agreement. The other 2 suppliers both achieve level 2 and are also appointed. The buyer requests that they maintain that level and puts a monitoring plan in place for those suppliers. So that runs you through how, if there was sort of more ambitious requirements set out, this would be played out in the procurement stage. I'll pass over to Terry for the second scenario now. If we could go to the next slide for him, please.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, so I agree that that's definitely a more advanced and sophisticated kind of deployment that we foresee. So I'm going to run through a slightly different scenario here, where in this case we have a lot of smaller suppliers involved. So in this case, it's another kind of LTA for, let's say it's for blood bags, that will commence next year. So what the buyer would kind of do its market assessment and understand that there's a range of different suppliers. A lot of them are small companies, and that, importantly, there's quite a lot of good competition in the marketplace for that particular product. So reflecting on the fact that a lot of the companies are small and come from a diverse set of geographies, the buyer kind of would decide to use the SPH in a way where the participants simply had to disclose their score, not achieve a minimum performance threshold. So the buyer takes the approach here of just introducing them to the index and kind of starting that sustainability journey with them. But that then within the terms and conditions for that LTA, they could then choose to include a clause that the suppliers have to demonstrate at least a level 1 performance, if they don't already, within the first 2 years of that LTA. So this then kind of motivates them, the suppliers, to work towards a higher level of performance than they may be at the present time. There may then be some different criteria to think about. So in terms of the geographies, some of the aspects of the SPH may apply differently. So for example, in some countries there may be different social dimensions to consider. And then having received the results from each of the suppliers, the buyer can then appoint them onto the framework and put in place that monitoring plan to then motivate the suppliers to monitor their performance over the duration of the LTA. And then as part of their kind of quarterly meetings that can be monitored, and the suppliers can demonstrate to the buyer how they are aiming to improve sustainable outcomes for the products that the buyer is procuring. So that's just 2 kind of quick scenarios that we have put together just to give you a bit of an illustration as to how the index could fit and integrate within the procurement process. 2 different scenarios. There are many other permutations, and as we mentioned, we'll be really keen to understand feedback from yourselves as to how you could see it fitting into the way that you procure healthcare commodities at present.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Terry. So user journeys is, and the 2 that you saw there, is a small tool that we've applied on the project to really unpack and explore, I guess, the different situations where we think the index may be applied and used. And a question really to you both. You only showed 2 examples. Now, I know on the project we've looked at sort of another 6, 7 or 8 in different settings and different people types and organization types. But could you give us a sense of some of the limitations around this, or are there any limitations? I mean, we're thinking different geographies, we're thinking different product categories. Are there some particular boundaries around this, or is the index designed to be flexible in many, many different settings beyond even those that we've looked at?
Thanks, Christian. I would say that bearing in mind the proportionality aspects that we've mentioned a few times, our criteria isn't overly tailored to any one specific sector, a healthcare commodity type, other than some very high-level principal areas. So pharmaceuticals is one of those areas, but it isn't we haven't designed it to be very specific to a very precise product or healthcare commodity that someone might choose to buy. So there will be some limitations in terms of the level of detail that a buyer might expect. And of course, the buyer can always supplement a tender with further questions that do dig into that detail. But we're really focused on having broad applicability so that we can build a bit of momentum behind the index and support its more widespread deployment.
Exactly, and I think that's really a bit of a signal for the future, as the SPHS, UNDP, Healthcare Harm colleagues in these organisations work to build out this agenda with their partners. We will see the index, which in a first version really is what we're showing to you today, in fact a beta version, a version before it is launched, is being created around an approach that enables detail to be brought into it over time as is appropriate, perhaps to different country settings or buying scenarios, or indeed product category areas as Terry was describing. So I'm going to ask to switch to the next slide now, and we're in the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation. We've got two aspects to cover. Terry's going to give us a bit of a perspective to the piloting exercise that we're going to go into in the next phase of work. But I'm also just going to ask Ali, who's keeping us tight on the technical side today, if there were any questions coming through on the email platform through the G20 Secretariat. If there are, please send them over. If not, no problems. We'll round off with a few little questions from myself back to the team. But in the first instance, Terry, maybe just give us a bit of a perspective around the piloting phase of the project that we'll be looking to do early in the new year.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. So next slide, please. So just to give an overview of what our aims and objectives are in piloting, we're really looking to test out the content and the form of the SPIH. So by content, I mean the criteria and questions that we're going to set out, how the scoring system works, that kind of thing, and form in terms of how it's accessed via the platform. So we're really looking for organisations to help test, challenge, raise suggestions, that kind of thing, so that we can really make sure that the first version of the SPIH is as sharp as it possibly can be and as appropriate as it possibly can be. So what we're asking for is for organisations to come forward. We have identified some already through our existing research and connections, but we're very open to organisations coming forward. And to do this testing within the first 2 months of next year, principally. As I mentioned, the key points are around the content. So we would expect companies to try and use it as if it was a real thing, to answer the questions genuinely, to consider the content and responses that are required, the evidence that would be required, and that kind of thing. They must be able to access the web platform as well, and be willing to kind of contribute to a questionnaire that we would issue alongside with the access to the web platform to capture thoughts and comments about the SPH. And if anyone is interested in participating in that, then we would encourage them to reach out to Ian Milimo, who is our lead project manager from the UNDP, or Anna Tuddenham. Their email addresses are on this slide. They'll be on the next slide as well. So if you do reach out to them, if you are interested in putting yourself forward, that would be great, and we will respond to you as we prepare for the piloting phase. If we just skip to the next slide, please. And we're particularly interested in participation from organisations that might be based in a ship country or have significant supply chain relations in ship countries. One of our target audiences is those ship countries, so it's really key and critical that we get feedback from them. We're also very interested in companies that either have their own manufacturing process or have tier 1 suppliers that do the manufacturing that they work with. And we are very interested in organisations of all sizes, so from the big multinationals right down to the smaller SME type organisations. All of those are really important. All of them are a target for the SPH. So we'd encourage you not to hold back. We would be willing to discuss that with anyone. Thank you.
That's great, Terry. Thank you very much. Okay, so I haven't had any questions land. So what I'm going to do, if we just switch to the next slide, is I have some pre-prepared myself, as you might imagine. And I'm going to just put these questions really across to Terry, Anna, and Callum, and offer seek some feedback and some perspective to them. I'm interested in I guess the ownership of this index, the SPIH, and the legacy that it will have in terms of how it will be looked after, cared for, and developed into the future. Are we able to offer a perspective around that, and for example, how it will be kept up to date? Maybe I should be a bit more specific. I guess, Terry, that might come your way, because I think you've been in the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of actually developing it and thinking about the platform and where it will be sitting and hosted and so on. So Terry, how's it going to be kept up to date, and how do you think that might evolve over time?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. To answer that fairly briefly, the index will be hosted on the SPHS platform. Clearly, the two key organisations there are the UNDP and Healthcare Without Harm. The idea is that they will own the product in the long run, and there will be a governance process in place owned by them to keep up to date, to review and to manage the deployment of the index in the coming years. So that's still to be defined, but that is the kind of model. The platform itself is directly managed by in the SPHS platform. So on a day-to-day level, the UNDP and Healthcare Without Harm teams will be the points of contact for that once it's launched.
Hello, can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, sorry, I've lost all audio at my end. So I'm going to I think Terry stopped talking, so I'm going to ask my second question. My second question, actually, this was to go back to Callum, because he never answered my first question back at the beginning. Callum, I was interested to hear from you about the scope of the index and the SDGs that are so important in many different settings around framing what sustainability is about. Could you offer me a perspective around that, please?
Sure, thanks, Christian. I think on a simple level, you can look at the 4 dimensions of the index, and you can relate them fairly easily to certain of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the 4 dimensions, if you look at the first one, greenhouse gas emissions, that relates fairly closely to SDG 13 on climate action. If you look at the one on resource depletion, water, energy and material consumption, that relates fairly closely to SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production, and perhaps also to the ones on sustainable cities. The one on chemical toxic impact on human health and the environment, that will relate fairly closely to SDG 3 on good health and well-being, perhaps SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, and SDGs 14 and 15, life below water and life on land. And then the 4th dimension, human, labour rights and gender equality, there's an obvious link there to SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, and then SDG 5 on gender equality. So just looking on the goal level, you can see an alignment between the 4 domains in the index and certain SDGs. You can then go into it in a bit more detail So just as a simple example, if you go into SDG 12, on responsible consumption and production, target 12.4 in there talks about achieving the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste throughout their life cycle. So you can get actually into a little bit more detail looking at specific targets within the SDGs. And so you could map those across various of the components of the index, and you'd be able to see a closer alignment there. So I think, as I said, on a simple level, you can relate the domains to the SDG goals, and then you can go to a more detailed level where you're looking at some of the indicators within the domains and relating to targets.
That's great. Thank you, Callum. So we're almost up on time. I'm just going to take the last minute just to bring a little bit more clarity to the pilot phase. We mentioned shipped countries. So if you're in a shipped country, we're really interested to hear from you. The countries that are important here include India, China, Brazil, Argentina, Moldova, South Africa, Ukraine, Tanzania, Vietnam, and Zambia. There are also a number of countries in Latin America, including Colombia, Chile, Argentina. I think I mentioned Brazil, Costa Rica, and in Southeast Asia we have the Philippines, the Republic of South Korea, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So if you're in one of those countries and you've enjoyed listening to what we've talked about today, we'd be really interested to hear from you. Anna's email address and Ian Millamo's email address, Anna part of our team, Ian working at UNDP. Please reach out to them. We'll be moving into piloting early in the first quarter of next year, and we'd be really keen to explore whether this is something that you could form a part of, either as a buyer or a supplier, so you get a bit of an early perspective of what we're doing here, and we get some great learning and improvement of the index through your engagement and participation. So that brings us to a close today, everybody. Thank you for your time. Thank you to my team, Callum, Anna, and Terry, for the effort and the presentations today. And of course, also to our organizers. Thank you very much.